Alright, I'm about to round out the stream, so for the last bit, I'm just going to talk about hybrid cards. Do just the basic card evaluation stuff. For those of you who aren't familiar with what we're doing, we're just going over each card in turn, talking about their strengths and weaknesses, what they do, whether they're good in ranked or draft. And I've gone through every color now, so we're just focused on the hybrid cards. Fearless Nomad. So 3-1 Overwhelm in Rakano colors, which is red and green. This card is very, very nasty and aggressive, and works pretty well in Rakano decks if you're just trying to run people over with weapons. It's got very good stats in general, and that's always good stuff. Fearless Nomad is pretty strong early on. It is easy to kill, so that's kind of a weakness, and the main problem that it has is that it's sometimes a 2-drop, and as a 2-drop it's not particularly useful. I think it's a pretty good card in Rakano decks. I don't really like it too much in draft, but it works okay. It's definitely aggressive enough, and it trades well enough. It's got good stats overall. Forces somebody to kill it pretty quick. Having 1 health at 1 power is not really all that big a deal, because if you get torched out, it doesn't mean that you spent your mana or you spent your power inefficiently. This card can be quite decent. Champion of Glory. This is a 1-1 that when it has when you have 2 red influence, it has +2 attack and quick draw. When you have 2 green influence, it has +2 health and endurance. Notoriously hard to kill, actually. It can't be permafrosted, which is kind of annoying. Tends to be fairly beefy. It's pretty likely that it's going to get to the double red, double green requirements that it needs to be a valuable creature, especially if you are just playing a Rakano deck. So Champion of Glory tends to be a pretty solid card in Standard. The main disadvantage that it doesn't is that it doesn't have Warcry or Overwhelm, which are two abilities that Rakano decks just love. Still, this card is a good thing to put your weapons on because it is the one that's most likely to survive outside of Crownwatch Paladin. And it's most likely to survive in like the heat of battle as well. It's a really, really strong card like all of the champions. Quite aggressive and wonderful. This is of course part of the champion cycle, and we'll be going through each of those. Rakano Morningstar, red and green, 3-2. This is just the best base stat weapon at 2. In draft it is just a stupid beating, and it's not really any worse in Standard. Rakano decks can just keep on hitting things with this stuff, and this is definitely their substitute for Crownwatch Longsword, the 2-cost green card. If you are in Rakano, you get the advantage of that 1 extra power, and then of course Warcries tend to make this like a 6-7 or a 7-6. Tends to come out for a surprising beating like all of the Rakano weapons. It's lovely, and it sees play in both draft and standard. Rakano Artisan, 2-2. Summon all weapons in your deck, get +1/+1. This card is just good. It's good in both Rakano equipment decks and Rakano weapon, like relic weapon decks, like armory style. Both of those are top tier, like ladder decks at the moment, and ranked has just done really well with them in general. The bonuses that relic weapons get are probably a little more relevant than the bonuses that regular weapons get, but in both instances, it really adds a ton of value to your cards. The disadvantage, of course, is that sometimes you don't see the weapons that are getting the +1/+1. It doesn't have an immediate effect on the board. Still, this card makes all of your pulls better, so if you get it early on, it's wonderful. If you get it late, it's not that great a drop. Run it in Standard for sure. Draft, it's just fine if you've got the weapons. Crownwatch Deserter, 3-3 Warcry. Very well statted creature with Warcry. Pretty hard to kill. About the most average of the hybrid Rakano cards, I would say. Like, this card is only okay. It's definitely something you want to pick in draft. It will occasionally make its way into a standard deck just so that you can get a nice 3 curve. But Champion of Glory is a 3-3 for 2. Crownwatch Deserter's Warcry is relevant, so that makes it just slightly better, but for the most part this card can sometimes get skipped on the slot. I think it's okay, and yeah, it definitely works pretty well with the rest of the Rakano stuff. The other thing you have to worry about here is that Crownwatch Deserter shares the same cost and hybrid power with Sword of Icaria, which if you are just starting out, I recommend as your very first craft. This card is super strong. It's solid removal that gives you a Warcry. It is just a beating in general. It works well in armory decks. It works well in aggressive Rakano strategies. If you don't have this in your Rakano decks, you should probably think about running it because it's both good removal and the kind of Warcries that you need to make this deck work. Yeah, Sword of Icaria is just like one of the baseline best uncommons. It is an extremely strong card, and Rakano decks are usually a great place to start when you're playing Pauper, so Sword of Icaria is definitely like one of the first things that you should be looking at. Battler Centaur, 2/5 Endurance Charge, not that great in Standard. Just it's hard to kill, but it doesn't quite do enough. Without a Warcry, it doesn't really fit in a lot of the Rakano strategies, but it is fairly difficult to kill. The charge effect is sort of meaningless, but not awful. And if it gets enough Warcries on it, it actually becomes a very threatening creature because it's, yeah, just kind of rough. But yeah, this card doesn't see a lot of play in Standard. It's a great pick in Draft. It's just too big and difficult to handle. And if it gets a weapon, it becomes completely intolerable. Just a monster. Deep Forged Plate, +4/+4, Overwhelm, and Endurance. Oh man, this card may be too strong. The double influence requirements make it just ridiculous to cast, so that's kind of like the one thing that you have going for you. But Deep Forged Plate like really provides a lot in terms of value. There's a similar card that's a +1/+3 that gives endurance, and that card is quite sick in Draft, and it would have been sick in Standard if it had like a little bit more in terms of stats. Deep Forged Plate is just ridiculous. The Overwhelm is like an incredible bit of icing on the cake. The Endurance is really the thing that you care about, because you get to put this thing on anything that has a permafrost. And then everyone who is saying that permafrost is overpowered is just kind of agape, because the permafrost falls off, and the creature that results is disgusting, and able to attack that turn. If you have Warcries, this card is usually like an 8/8 or a 6/6 or something ridiculous when you finally end up playing it. It's really quite a beating. Tends to come out of nowhere. It's just gonna win you the game when it happens. I think this card is really sick good, and maybe desirous of a nerf. Hard to say. In any case, it's a nuts legendary. Lots of fun. Hoard Sergeant, 2/4, Warcry. Whenever you Warcry, you gain 1 armor. There isn't a deck that really runs this right now, but it does sort of work in the sort of mid-rangey strategies that you want. I think the fact that there are so many good 4-cost Rakano cards rallying for this position makes it a little bit weaker. But the Warcry and the Warcry effect are both good. It's a lovely card in Draft, and if you manage to get like Warcry with relic weapons in Draft, then this card is just going to beef you up crazily. The extra armor is a lot of fun. Ways to gain extra armor can be relevant when you're playing relic weapon decks, when you're playing plated demolisher decks. Yeah, there are some things that you can do with this, but it's not necessarily gonna do anything super fantastic. It's just hard to kill, and it does reward Warcries very well, and Warcry strategies are pretty good. Usually, Warcry Rakano decks don't really care about their 4-drops. They have Deep Forged Plate, and then that's about it, so Hoard Sergeant tends to fall by the wayside at that point. In Standard, in Draft, it's lovely. Navani Warsinger, Warcry. Navani's Warcry affects all units and weapons in your deck. This is just like a super fun design. Like, so fun. Every time you attack with it, you gain value. Even like, if this card attacks into like a completely suicidal charge and like gets eaten by a 5/5, it may still have provided your deck with some serious value in the long run. So yeah, attacking with this creature is really, really quite nice. It's got a decent amount of beef on it. It's a 4/4. I don't think it's too small for the cost, especially considering the amount of effect that it's got. But yeah, like the main thing about it is that it is a very slow card, and in particular, that's makes it less relevant in Rakano Warcry decks that are like really aggressive, and more relevant in Rakano decks that are fairly defensive, like Armory. Armory decks will occasionally run this. Sometimes it doesn't fit, sometimes it does. I think there are a lot of different situations where this card is pretty good, and it's kind of sad that it doesn't fit in the current Standard meta. I think it's a really good card in general, and it's always going to be fun to play, and it's always going to be relatively powerful. Giving it charge with something like Accelerate could be pretty cool. There are a lot of interesting options to keep this card down and then just make all of the cards in your deck forever awful. Okay, Renegade Valkyrie, double damage flying. This is and it's a 1/2 in Rakano colors. This is an okay pick in Draft. Standard decks can't really build around it too much because it's a little bit too weak, and it's very, very likely to get killed because the double damage thing is really scary, as people probably know. Oh yeah, Warhelm's not bad. You can certainly use that. Yeah, in any case, Renegade Valkyrie is just crazy nuts if you give it a weapon or a rampage or basically anything along those lines. Double damage is a really powerful skill that just makes all of your buff spells a lot stronger. This card is quite okay in draft because it's essentially a 2-2 just by itself, and a 2-2 flyer for 4 is mostly okay. And then if you rampage it or something, it just ends the game. In Standard, it's just a little too weak. It's going to get torched, it's going to get killed by something because nobody wants to let that card live. Righteous Fury, give a unit lifesteal and double damage as a fast spell, which is kind of a cool trick. This is a weird trick in draft, and not altogether bad. It's also an okay trick in Standard, but definitely not more than a 1 or 2 of, because it does incur some distinct disadvantage. If you put this on anything that's going to swing in for a lot of damage, then it's going to just outright win you the game. Like, not only is the damage usually unrecoverable, but also the amount of life that you swing back is pretty relevant in draft. So that makes it a really nice fast spell if you can pick it up at rare. It's just too expensive in Standard for the most part. Rakano decks are either concerned with attacking with weapons or attacking with tiny creatures, so Righteous Fury often doesn't work all that well. But it might have a place, and I think I've seen it have a place in... Okay, Rise to the Challenge. Draw a unit or weapon of your choice from your deck. It gets +2 attack. Very strong card. The cheapest tutor in the game. A tutor is any card that basically searches your deck. So yeah, it's a really cheap way to get like a particular card that you want. That card is usually Icaria or Sword of the Sky King or a couple of other things, and the bonus that it gives is also quite nice. This is a really nice slow Rakano card, and it's probably an auto-include in a slow Rakano deck because it's such a good toolbox. It definitely gets you a lot of different cards that you want. The main disadvantage, of course, is that the toolbox that it gets you is almost always something that does damage as opposed to something that does a particular effect. But you can make that work as well. If you give a unit that has double damage, it does not double again. It is not a quadruple damage. So yeah, that skill does not stack. Sorry. Coup de grace. Ready your units, they can attack again as a single spell. This card deserves some love in Standard, I think. It's probably only okay in draft. Like, even if you get it as a legendary, it's not necessarily going to do anything great for you. In terms of, like, Rakano Warcry decks, this is actually a pretty decent swing. It makes it so that you can double up on a particularly good turn of attacks. It is often exactly what it says on the tin, i.e. a coup de grace, and will finish off your opponent quite well. Good way to finish your opponent at 5, I'd say. It is some amount of disadvantage, so if you're not in a winning situation, it definitely doesn't help you out there, but it's a very good way to end the game very fast. I think it deserves more love in Standard than in Ranked than it currently has. Other than that, I don't have anything to say about it. It hasn't really seen a lot of play yet. I'm looking forward to seeing some more decks use this card. Field Captain, +1 attack for each time you or one of your units have attacked this game. This card's a little too basic in Standard for like its vanilla stats to be all that important. The amount of attack it has is usually just atrocious in Rakano decks. It tends to end up with around an 11-5 when it's actually played. Sometimes it ends up as a 0-5 if you're not being aggressive enough, but in general it seems to like just be pretty ridiculous, and a 7-5 in draft is pretty common, I would say. Yeah, it's a very well-statted card in draft, and the fact that it just constantly gains more attack is really relevant. It tends to trade in very well with everything larger than it. It does a lot of damage when it's unanswered, so it's a good card in draft for that reason. In Standard, just doesn't quite do enough. If you're attacking that much, you've already won. Ijin, Imperial Armorer. 5/5 for 5, double influence on this one. Pay 5 and exhaust Ijin to play a +5/+5 mithril armor on one of your units. This is a recurring value card in Rakano, and Rakano has a lot of like really interesting slow control toolboxes that aren't really being explored in Standard right now. This card is quite nuts, of course. You can play it out for 10 to get a 10/10 straight away. It can get killed pretty easily, so it's kind of tricky. But it's got enough stats that it's usually not too bad a creature to just play cold in Standard. I think in draft this thing is obviously just disgusting for every reason. Just doesn't do anything but continue to make value for you, and every turn you'll basically just want to put a big +5/+5 on somebody. Yeah, currently this one does like occupy the position of a very sad Seraph, and it does not really do too much at the moment. It's not really in standard, which is a pity because it's a really lovely design. Ferocious Stranger, 4/4 strangers deal double damage. This is a good stranger. Actually, it's quite decent. It's essentially an 8/4, which is not awful at 6. That makes it a decent draft card for sure, and the fact that it just suddenly surprises everybody with strangers that deal double damage is quite strong. The cost is very prohibitive. This is a super expensive card. I wouldn't really say that it's worthwhile in a standard mode for the same reason that I don't consider most stranger decks worthwhile in standard mode, but in particular, 6-cost strangers are just notoriously hard to get to. Yeah, the double damage is very relevant. It certainly does just turn everything and turn the entire game into like just it's a slaughter if you actually get it down and you have strangers up. But that's a huge win more, and it's a huge win more in just strangers. So kind of a tricky card, probably not that good, but it's definitely worth picking in draft because, like, even if you don't get any other strangers, this is still okay. It's not awful. Starsteel Die Show, 4/4. Your avatar can attack twice each turn. My, what a fun card. One of the things you can do with this is if you have a relic weapon equipped already, you can attack with it, equip a Starsteel Die Show, and take a second attack. That's not necessarily value, but it's a notable thing that you should keep an eye on, because Starsteel Die Show does play that way. This card is really, really, really good to Warcry. It's quite strong if you can get it on a Rise to the Challenge and play it on an empty board. The main risk, of course, is that it's not necessarily going to remove 2 creatures for you, since it only has 4 toughness. You need to make sure that you have enough armor to make that work. You need to try to buff it in some way to make it just ridiculous. But yeah, that double damage effect, that double choice of relic weapons, makes it pretty strong. And as a result, it definitely sees a lot of play in armory decks in particular. This card is just bonkers. It's always been kind of bonkers, and it's pretty strong right now. I don't see a lot of it in standard, but it does play out in armory, which is slow control with weapons. Icaria the Liberator, yet another incredibly fun design, and the top of the Rakano list. Okay, so this is a 5/5 with Flying, Endurance, Warcry 5, Charge, and Aegis. So if we break that down, it comes out immediately, goes into an attack, immediately buffs your top weapon for 5, and all of that happens before your opponent can respond to it. Then it's still a flying creature in the air attacking you, and you have to spend 2 spells to kill it. It's really, really good. Yeah, it's an absolute beating at 7. It's a huge reward for going into Rakano. It's probably capable of topping out a small Rakano list, but you don't see people run it too much because it's not fast enough. And in a slow Rakano list, this is just a finisher, and it will usually do something just amazing. Icaria the Liberator's only weakness is that she often doesn't win the game outright. She will sometimes just do her 5/5 thing, do the 5 damage, get the Warcry, and then you'll have to rely on top decking another card to kill them, but that card will have a ridiculous bonus. Yeah, in general, this card is just extremely strong. It's a very good anti-control card, and it's a really nice heavy drop that you can play. Just a lovely, lovely standard card. Obviously, in drafts, this would just destroy everyone. There wouldn't be any way to recover from it. Like, maybe the best draft card at 7? Oh, definitely the best draft card at 7. Okay. Combre is next. So this is Time Justice.